This is the end of lease procedures module in your aDoor property management training. We always prepare for the end of the lease. So when a tenant signs a lease, typically they sign a lease on a term basis, and most of the time that term means 12 months. So for 12 months they are under a lease agreement, and as we get towards the end of the 12 months, we're preparing for the end of the lease. So there are some procedures and steps that we need to take, but we're going to go over, basically what are those procedures and why are we doing it and kind of what are we looking for. So in general terms, the procedures are here to make sure that we are renewing tenants if we want to renew them. Are they vacating? Do they want to leave, or do they want to stay? And what is the kind of tenant that we're dealing with? Have they had a good tenant history? Have they have a bad tenant history? So we're making an assessment of what to do with this tenant as we approach the end of the tenancy. And so these procedures are important in regards to ensuring that tenants have vacated at the end of the tenancy so we can re-rent the property and take possession back, and also to make sure that we make a correct and legally sound changes or charges against the tenant's account if they fail to comply with their obligations regarding giving notice to vacate at the end of the lease term. And I can explain more on that in just a minute. So what are we determining whenever we look at the end of the lease? Well, we're determining, again, what to do with the existing tenants. Are we going to renew or non-renew? Does the tenant want to renew or non-renew? And if we do in fact want to renew, on what term do we want to renew the tenant? So what the steps, and you'll see this in the lease simple process in more detail, but effectively what we need to know from the tenant is, do you want to renew or not? And we send a notice to the tenant where it asks the tenant, do you want to stay or are you planning on leaving? If the tenant says we want to stay, then we know that we need to do some steps to make sure we want to renew the tenancy. Now, pause for a second, and I'll say that if we know that we're not going to renew the tenant because the history of the tenancy just shows that this has not been a good tenant, we need to find someone else, then we're not going to take some of these steps. We're going to cut right to the chase and say, we're not going to renew your tenancy. We give them notice of that, and that way we don't have to do any other steps. We simply know we're not going to renew. But if we think we want to renew and the tenant informs us that they would like to renew as well, in general, we have a good practice of requiring the tenant to apply again for the rental of the next term. And so we send notice of the tenant's requirement to make application again, and then once we receive the application, then we can review their updated background information. So some things may in fact change with the tenant during the past 12 months, and that could include their income, revenue. It could include criminal charges. It could include their credit score, filing bankruptcy. I mean, any number of things could have changed within the past 12 months for this tenant. And so that's why we have the tenants apply again, so we can make sure that they still qualify to have a tenancy at that location for another term. Another thing that we have to do is to inspect the property to see if the tenant has taken care of the property. Now, we do have other inspections that we perform, but this is one of the inspections that happens about 90 days prior to the end of the lease term, because we want to make sure that during the tenancy, the tenant has cared for the property properly. And so that's another part of the process that we include in the determination. Another thing is, as I stated, is we review the tenancy to determine if this tenant is one that we want to renew, or perhaps maybe we want to go month to month, but it's relevant to what kind of an offer we may make to a tenant who would like to stay in the property. And that tenancy review has to do with their payment history, property condition, any problems they may have created during the tenancy, the application results, and essentially a complete picture of what's happening. And then from there, of course, we're also looking at, well, what is the rent value going to be? If we're going to renew this tenancy, what is the new rental rate, if there's going to be a new rental rate? So with that, we will conduct another comparative market analysis, and we will then determine effectively what the rent rate will be, and we will include that in our communications to this tenant if we decide we're going to make an offer for a renewal, and we'll let them know what the rental rate is going to be, because that might in fact change the tenant's desire to stay there. So for example, if we increase the rent by a couple $100 a month based on our comparative market analysis, and we inform the tenant of that, the tenant may say, well, that's more than I want to spend, and they may end up not wanting to renew. Of course, with that, if we determine, well, maybe we don't want to lose this tenant, they've been a really good tenant, maybe the owner's okay with keeping the rent the same, or maybe not increasing it as much, we can kind of gauge from the communication with the tenant as to whether we are going to really enforce the increase, or if we think we want to incentivize the tenant to stay and not go as high on the rental rate. Ultimately, the decision of where to set the rent is up to the broker or the authorized licensed property manager. So, but that is a part of the process of determining whether we're renewing this tenancy or if we are, at what rental rate. And then from there, we need to notify the property owner essentially of the review that we just had. So we have the tenant saying they want to renew or they don't want to renew, or hey, we don't want to renew this tenant at all, or if we have decided to renew, here has been the process taking place. We have a new application from the tenant, they qualify or maybe they don't qualify. We've inspected the property, it looks good. The tenancy history has been good, we're good to go. And so, Mr. Owner, here is our recommendation. This is what we intend to do. And so we notify the owner effectively of what our decision is and the reasons why. And then from there, typically the owners go with our suggestions. Sometimes they may not, but typically they do. And so from there, if we decided to renew the tenancy, then of course we proceed in that manner. Now there's another aspect to this renewal process which you'll look at more in the lead simple process, but we do have a process in place to where we will give the tenants a notice that notifies them that they have to notify us of their intent to vacate or not. And you can see where this lies in this statute right here, 83.575, which effectively says that if the landlord gives this notice to the tenant, that they have to give us notice of their intent to vacate or not, and the tenant doesn't give us that notice within 30 and 60 days prior to, or within 30 to 60 days prior to the end of the natural expiration of the lease, there could actually be liquidated damages charged to the tenant. But for the purposes of just procedure, what you simply need to know is we will send out a notice 15 days before the tenant's obligation to notify us, or we notify the tenant of that obligation, and then we wait to see if the tenant in fact gives us that notice that they're required to give us. That is built into the lead simple process, and you'll see that. But the reason why is because we want the tenant to tell us if they intend to vacate the property at the end of the lease term. And then from just a communication standpoint, we always want to make sure that when we offer a tenancy to a tenant, a renewed tenancy, that we are clear about our offer and acceptance language. Offer and acceptance language is important because it can create the contractual terms by which the parties have to are obligated. So when you leave dates open, or they're open-ended dates, or there's not a clear course of action that has to be taken for a tenant to accept an offer, it really muddies the waters. It may not be clear. Did they in fact accept a renewal offer, or did they not? So in general terms, when we make offers to renew, we do so by saying, to accept the offer, you must do this by this date. And if you don't, then the offer is terminated. So you can see some sample language here. Now, don't worry. A lot of this stuff is built into templates. It's built into process and procedure. But keep in mind that when it comes to creating obligations on the tenant or our obligations, there has to be defined terms. What is the action that has to be done, and by what date does it have to be done? That's the important lesson here. So one of the things to really keep in mind is you can set traps for yourself if you're not careful. And one of the things that happens when it comes to the end of lease process is that tenants may try to get the property manager or some personnel to effectively commit verbally that, or through an email, that you're going to renew the lease. You never want to do that. So you got to watch your communications with your tenants, because if you say something or email something to the tenant that effectively says you're going to be renewed, or there's not going to be a rent increase, they're going to use that communication against us if that's in fact not what we end up doing. So anytime it comes to a tenant asking about the end of the lease term or what's going to happen after the lease term, the response is always, we will send you notice of what we intend to do, or we will send you notice of what you need to do to secure a new tenancy. And we do all of that through our forms. We do all that through the automated processes of this particular end of lease procedure. So general rule is just never commit anything regarding what we're going to do at the end of the lease. Rather, always refer to the process and procedure that we use to make those determinations. And then at the same time, if there's any important lease amendments that need to be in effect at the start of a new lease term, that we have to make sure that we have those lease terms implemented prior to the beginning of the next lease term. Periodically, the lease may be updated, or there might be provisions that need to be included, or we might inherit a lease agreement that was not ours to begin with. Maybe it came from another management company. Maybe it was just an individual landlord who had some landlord-tenant form that he downloaded. And so when it comes time to renew, we always want to make sure that we have the updated or the amended lease terms that we're going to effectively use for the next lease term. Always have that in your mind when you're thinking about end of lease terms and you're thinking about renewals. And really what that means is that they're going to be on our lease whenever we have a new lease term. Many times we'll have the tenant sign a new lease agreement, an entirely new lease agreement, even if they're just renewing. This is a decision, however, that's typically made by the broker or the authorized property manager. So whenever you have a question about that, always refer to the broker or the authorized property manager to make sure, hey, are there any new lease terms here that we need to implement, or are we just going to put them on a new lease agreement entirely? And they'll make sure that the right and proper form or agreement is presented to the tenant upon a renewal. Another thing about end of lease procedures is that it's an opportunity to level the playing field, as we say. So there may be a situation where a tenant needs to cure some kind of a default. It could be money they owe. It could be, hey, they need to cut the grass, or some condition or some obligation that the tenant really should be fulfilling and maybe they didn't. Maybe they've been a good tenant, but they just need to kind of tidy up some things or bring up some things current. So when it comes time for lease renewals, we always look at that as an opportunity to level that playing field. And if we decide we want to make an offer to renew, we include those items that have to be cured or brought to current, so that we can essentially start this tenant off fresh with no outstanding obligations or defaults or anything like that, and we can make sure that the owner's protected, that the property is taken care of, and that the balance that it's owed is where it needs to be. And so the lease renewal period actually is the time for that scenario to take place. Now, if we have decided not to renew this person because there's just too many things that are wrong, or too many problems that have happened, or it's apparent that the tenant can't afford to live there, or what have you, then it's not really a level the field opportunity. It's really just a matter of we're probably going to end up terminating the lease. So that is another aspect of the end of lease procedures that we keep in mind. And that will conclude this topic for now. Thank you for listening.